On a frozen Montana highway, in a storm so fierce it erased footprints seconds after they were made, a former Navy SEAL slammed his brakes. Because through the whiteout, he saw something no human should ever witness. A mother clutching a baby to her chest. 4 children stumbling behind her, their clothes far too thin for the deadly cold. No screams, no pleas, just silent determination, and fear they were too exhausted to hide. As the wind clawed at them, the man stepped out of his truck and spoke 6 words that would change all of their lives forever. Come with me. No one survives alone. What happens next will make you believe in quiet miracles and second chances for the forgotten. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from. Drop your country in the comments below. And if you believe no child or animal should ever face fear alone, hit subscribe, share this story, and help someone out there find hope tonight. The Montana sky had turned into a solid sheet of gray, with no clear line between earth and horizon. Winds swept across the mountain road, carrying sharp waves of snow that blurred everything ahead. Ethan Hale's old pickup truck moved steadily up the incline, its wipers working hard to keep the windshield clear. Ranger, his 4-year-old German Shepherd, sat in the passenger seat, alert whenever the truck slipped on a patch of ice. Ethan tightened his grip on the wheel. It had been years since he returned to his family's ranch, a place damaged by a violent winter storm and landslide. Part of the roof had collapsed, the fence line was broken, and the horse shed lay scattered in pieces. He planned to repair it little by little, or at least face the memories he had avoided for too long. As the truck reached a bend, the wind surged. Ranger suddenly stood up, ears pointed toward the road ahead. Ethan slowed immediately. Seconds later, the headlights revealed a figure on the shoulder, a woman. Behind her, 4 small children trudged through the snow, clinging to each other to stay upright. The woman held an infant tightly against her chest, using her shawl to shield the baby from the wind. All of them were underdressed for temperatures this low. Ethan hit the brakes. The truck slid slightly before stopping. He stepped outside, and the cold air struck him hard, biting at his lungs. The woman turned sharply, pulling her children behind her. Though exhausted, she positioned herself between Ethan and the kids with instinctive protection. "Stay where you are," she said, her voice rough from the cold. Ethan raised his hands slowly. "I'm not here to scare you," he said. "You and the children can't stay out here, not in this weather." Ranger stepped down from the truck and stood beside Ethan. His posture was alert but calm. The children stared at him with hesitation, but not fear. Ethan scanned their condition, lips turning blue, fingers trembling uncontrollably. Footprints disappearing almost instantly under the falling snow. There was no capacity for debate. Staying outside meant danger, immediate and real. He spoke clearly, choosing his words with care. "Come with me. No one survives out here alone." The woman held his gaze for several seconds. She didn't cry, she didn't plead. She simply weighed risk against survival, hers and her children's. At last, she gave a small nod. Ethan moved quickly but gently. He lifted each child into the truck, settling them near the heater. Ranger shifted to make room, lying along the door to avoid crowding them. The infant whimpered as the warm air touched his face, then quieted. The woman climbed in last. Before Ethan closed the door, she looked back at the empty white road, long, silent, and unforgiving, as if hoping for a reason her path had led her here. Ethan shut the door, returned to the driver's seat, and turned up the heat. The truck eased back, onto the road, leaving the storm behind them as much as it would allow. He had expected the ranch to be a place where he would confront his past. Tonight, it became the only shelter keeping a family alive. The cabin lights came into view as Ethan turned off the mountain road. The small structure stood against the hillside, sturdy but worn, its roof patched after years of harsh winters. Snow clung to the wood like a thin sheet of frost, but inside, a faint orange glow from the stove promised warmth. When the truck stopped, Ethan stepped out first. He opened the passenger door and lifted the children down one by one. Ranger stayed close, guiding them gently toward the steps with quiet nudges of his nose. Inside, the heat from the wood stove wrapped around them like a blanket. The air smelled faintly of pine and old timber. Ethan grabbed a stack of wool blankets from a cedar trunk and handed them to the children. They huddled together near the stove, their faces slowly regaining color. The woman stood near the doorway, arms still wrapped around the infant. Her breathing had steadied, but her posture remained tense, as if she wasn't sure safety was something she was allowed to trust. "I'm Ethan," he said, keeping his voice low so the children wouldn't startle. "This is Ranger. You're safe here." She hesitated before responding. "My name is Sarah," she said softly. "Sarah Wyaka." Her voice carried the kind of restraint learned from years of being careful with words. Ethan nodded. "Sit down. Warm up first. We'll figure out the rest later." She finally lowered herself onto the bench near the stove. The baby's cheeks were still red from the cold, but he had stopped crying, comforted by the heat and the steady rhythm of Sarah's heartbeat. For a while, the only sounds in the cabin were the crackling fire and the soft breathing of tired children. Ethan brewed hot water and poured it into tin cups, passing them around. Sarah accepted hers with a slight nod of thanks. When the children began drifting into sleep, Sarah spoke again, this time without looking up. "We left home last night," she said. "I waited until he passed out. I knew it was the only chance." Ethan didn't ask who he was. He had seen enough fear in people's eyes to recognize the residue it left behind. She continued, the words steady but heavy. "He wasn't always like that. Years ago, he worked hard. He laughed with the girls. But after the last baby came, things changed. The drinking got worse. The anger didn't stop." Ethan listened without interruption. It wasn't the kind of story that needed commentary, only space. Sarah glanced at her daughters sleeping under a single blanket, their hands still clasped together as if they feared being separated. "They've slept in fear for years," she said quietly. "Tonight is the first time they're not waking at every sound." Ethan looked into the stove, the flames reflecting off his eyes. "My family's ranch didn't survive that landslide 2 winters ago," he said. "I was deployed at the time. I got the news but couldn't come home fast enough to help." He didn't mention the guilt that followed him like a shadow, the knowledge that his brother had died trying to move the horses out of the collapsing shed. But the tension in his jaw made the truth clear enough. Ranger sensed the shift. He walked over and placed his head gently on Ethan's knee. Ethan gave the dog a quiet scratch behind the ear, steadying himself. Sarah watched him closely, not with judgment, but with the quiet understanding of someone who knew what loss looked like in others. Ethan met her eyes. "You and the children can stay here as long as you need. I won't let anything happen to you." She didn't reply immediately, but her shoulders eased just enough to show she believed him, at least for tonight. Outside, the storm continued to beat against the walls, but its fury no longer reached them. Inside, exhausted hearts and cold hands slowly began to settle, as though the cabin itself was teaching them how to breathe again. And while no one said the word, a fragile sense of safety began taking root. Not trust yet, but the simple relief of no longer facing the world alone. Morning arrived quietly, the kind of cold that settled into the ground and stayed there. Snow covered the ranch in a thin, even layer, softening the edges of the land still scarred from the old landslide. Ethan stepped outside early, carrying a hammer and several boards. Repairing the shed had become part routine, part discipline, something steady in a life that had lost its structure. Ranger trotted behind him, occasionally stopping to sniff the air, as if checking for threats only he could detect. Inside the cabin, Sarah moved with quiet purpose. She folded blankets, cleared the small table, and tried to restore some order to the space her children now temporarily called home. Their voices were soft, still cautious, but no longer trembling the way they had the night before. When she knelt to check under the bed for extra quilts, her hand brushed something unexpected. A small wooden chest tucked against the wall. The cedar wood was worn smooth by age. She pulled it out and set it on the bed. The children gathered around her, watching. Sarah opened the lid. Inside lay a dark indigo blanket, woven with white and silver lightning patterns. It was unmistakable, a blanket of her family line, the one her father had taken with him the night he disappeared. Sarah touched the fabric. Her fingers tightened slightly, the only sign of the emotion rising inside her. She had not seen this blanket since she was a teenager. The cabin door opened. Ethan stepped in, brushing snow from his sleeves. He paused when he saw the chest, then the blanket in Sarah's hands. His expression changed. Not surprise, but recognition. Sarah lifted her eyes to him. Her voice was steady, though quiet. "Where did you get this?" Ethan didn't answer right away. He removed his gloves and set them on the table, as if preparing himself. 15 years ago, he said, I had an accident on the mountain road. A storm like the one last night came fast. The ground gave out beneath my truck. My legs were pinned. I couldn't move. Sarah stayed still, watching him. A man appeared, Ethan continued. Lakota, strong, calm. He wrapped me in that blanket and tried to pull me free. Ranger, sensing the shift in the room, moved closer to Ethan's side. Ethan swallowed once before finishing. He got me out, but the ground beneath him collapsed. I couldn't reach him in time. Silence filled the cabin. Not sharp, but heavy. Sarah closed her eyes briefly, letting the facts settle. The time, the place, the blanket. There was no doubt. When she opened her eyes again, they were steady. It was my father. Ethan lowered his gaze. I never came to your family. I told myself it wasn't my right. Truth is, I was afraid. Afraid of facing what my survival cost. Sarah rose, gathering the baby into her arms. She called for her daughters. The girls came to her side, sensing her tension even without understanding the words. She walked toward the door. Ethan followed her outside, keeping a respectful distance. Snow fell lightly, enough to cover fresh footprints. The air was cold enough to sting, but not as brutal as the night before. When the children slowed, Sarah finally turned back to him. My father saved your life, she said quietly, and he never came home. I know, Ethan replied, and I carry that with me every day. Sarah looked at her children, tired, bundled in blankets, standing beside her because they had nowhere else to stand. Then she looked back at the cabin, warm and steady behind Ethan. I can't forgive you, she said. Not now. Ethan didn't argue, he simply nodded. But the children need shelter, so we go back. She stepped past him, heading toward the cabin. The girls followed her in a small line. Ethan remained where he was, letting the snow settle on his jacket. Ranger nudged his hand softly, grounding him. And there, in the quiet winter air, two histories, both shaped by loss, finally collided. Over the next few days, a fragile rhythm formed inside the cabin. Not comfort, not yet, but routine. Ethan worked outside each morning, clearing debris left from the old landslide and reinforcing the weakened beams of the shed. The air smelled of cold earth and sawdust. Ranger remained close, occasionally stopping to watch the cabin door, as if guarding the new lives inside it. Sarah spent her time tending to the children, teaching them simple tasks, folding blankets, carrying small bundles of firewood, helping prepare warm meals. Their movements, once anxious and guarded, began to soften. The girls spoke a little more each day. The baby slept longer stretches at night. For the first time in years, Sarah allowed herself small breaths that did not feel like preparation for danger. By the seventh morning, the snow had settled into a firm crust across the yard. The sky was a pale blue, the kind that often preceded another storm but offered temporary calm. Ethan was repairing a loose shutter when Ranger suddenly stiffened, ears pushed forward, eyes locked on the road. Ethan followed the dog's gaze. A dark truck was approaching, smooth, polished, out of place on a mountain road, still half frozen. Behind it rolled a county sheriff's vehicle. Ethan's shoulders tightened instinctively. Ranger let out a low rumble. He stepped off the porch, wiping his hands on his jeans. The black truck stopped first. The door opened and a man stepped out, tall, broad-shouldered, with long black hair tied loosely behind his head. His expression carried the unmistakable blend of anger and entitlement. Sarah's husband. Sarah appeared at the doorway behind Ethan. Her hand instantly drew her children close, the same protective instinct Ethan had witnessed on the snowy road. The youngest girl hid behind her mother's leg. The older ones went silent, their bodies tensing the moment they recognized the man. The sheriff, Cole Maddox, climbed out of the second vehicle. He adjusted his hat and approached with slow, steady steps. "Morning," he said, though his eyes were already assessing the scene. The husband, Towan, ignored the greeting. His gaze landed on Sarah with hard accusation. "So, this is where you ran to," he said, "playing house with a stranger, taking my kids?" Sarah didn't move. Her voice when she spoke was quiet but firm. "I left because we weren't safe." Towan scoffed, the sound sharp in the cold air. Ethan stepped forward, not aggressively, but enough to place himself between Sarah and the man approaching her. "That's close enough," Ethan said. Ranger stood beside him, muscles coiled but controlled. Sheriff Maddox lifted a hand to signal calm. "Let's talk inside," the sheriff said. "We need to sort this out properly." Inside the cabin, the tension became even more visible. The children clung to Sarah, recoiling every time Towan spoke. The sheriff noticed immediately. He asked questions. Simple, clear, careful. Sarah answered quietly, describing the drinking, the threats, the nights she'd sat awake holding the baby, because she didn't know what Towan would do next. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't cry. The details alone were enough. Sheriff Maddox turned to Towan. Based on what I'm seeing and hearing, I'm opening a domestic abuse file. You will appear in town court tomorrow morning. Towan's jaw tightened. You can't take my family away. They're not safe with you, the sheriff replied. There was no anger in his tone, just certainty. Towan glared at Ethan. This isn't over. Ethan didn't blink. We'll handle whatever comes. The sheriff led Towan outside. The man slammed the truck door so hard the windows of the cabin shook. Snow sprayed behind his tires as he sped off. When the sheriff returned to his vehicle, he paused beside Sarah. I'll do everything I can, he said gently. You did the right thing. Then he tipped his hat and drove away, leaving the ranch surrounded by silence. Sarah stood in the doorway with her children. Ethan stood a few feet away, letting her decide whether to approach, whether to speak. She met his gaze. For the first time, there was no fear in it, only exhaustion, and the faintest trace of relief. Ranger nudged Ethan's leg, sensing the shift. There would be more storms after this. Legal, emotional, unpredictable, but for now, they remained exactly where they needed to be, together, inside a home that would not let them freeze, and under the protection of a man who would not let them face danger alone. The courthouse in Carbon County was small, built of old brick and trimmed with white paint that had begun to chip from too many cold seasons. When Ethan parked the truck outside, Sarah sat quietly in the passenger seat, her hands folded around the baby's blanket. Her daughters stayed close to her, moving as a single group, their eyes scanning the unfamiliar building. Ethan opened the door for them. Ranger hopped out next, his paws landing softly on the thin layer of snow. Though he wasn't officially allowed inside, no one had the heart, or reason, to turn him away once they saw the children holding onto his fur as if it were an anchor. Inside, the courtroom smelled faintly of pine plush and old paper. Morning light filtered through tall windows, casting pale squares of gold across the benches. It looked nothing like a battlefield, yet everyone walking in carried their own version of a wound. Sarah stood at the front, wearing a simple dark dress borrowed from one of Sheriff Maddox's neighbors. Her hair was braided neatly down her back, and despite the tension around her eyes, she held herself with quiet dignity. Ethan sat a few rows behind her. His presence wasn't loud or commanding, just steady, the way a beam holds up part of a roof without being seen. Ranger lay at his feet, still as stone, except for the gentle rise and fall of his chest. Judge Helen Rower entered, a woman in her early 60s, with silver hair pulled into a bun and eyes that read people faster than words could be spoken. She took her seat and nodded to the clerk. Towan Waiaka, the clerk called. Towan walked in, shoulders squared, jaw tight. There was no remorse in his expression, only irritation that the world had dared to question him. He sat across from Sarah, arms crossed, tapping a finger against his knee, like a man who believed this was all an inconvenience. Judge Rower looked at Sarah first. "When you're ready," she said. Sarah stepped forward. Her voice didn't shake, though her fingers tightened slightly on the edge of the podium. She told the story plainly, how the drinking had worsened, how the anger had turned unpredictable, how the nights grew longer, quieter, more dangerous, how the girls had learned to hide at the sound of a slammed door, how she had waited for a window of safety and found it in a blizzard. There were no dramatics in her voice, no embellishment, only facts. Facts that weighed more heavily than any raised voice could. Judge Rower listened without interrupting, her expression steady but softened by understanding. Sheriff Maddox testified next. He described what he'd seen at Ethan's ranch. The children shrinking from their father's presence. The bruises still visible on Sarah's wrists. The way Ethan had created immediate structure and safety without being asked. Ranger looked up every time Maddox said the children's names, as if checking that they were still safe in the back row. When Tawan took the stand, his tone was defensive, dismissive. "She exaggerates," he said. "She always does. Mr. Waiaka," Judge Rower interrupted, "I need facts, not opinions." He faltered, then glared at Sarah as if she were responsible for every unraveling moment. After a long pause, the judge folded her hands. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was clear and firm. "This marriage is dissolved. Full custody of the children will be granted to the mother. A protective order is issued immediately. Mr. Waiaka, you are prohibited from approaching Ms. Waiaka or her children within 300 yards. The words seemed to settle over the room like fresh snow. soft but absolute. Sarah closed her eyes briefly, letting out a breath she had held for years, not triumph, just release. Towin surged to his feet, anger flashing across his face, but two deputies stepped forward before he could speak. Judge Rower's gavel struck once. "Court is adjourned." Outside, Ethan walked beside Sarah as she carried the baby. The girls held on to Ranger, who led them gently down the steps. The air was crisp, but lighter than when they arrived, as if the weight of the case had lifted part of the winter from the sky. Sarah looked at Ethan once they reached the truck. There was no dramatic change in her expression, no sudden trust, no sudden warmth. But there was something new: space, a quiet acknowledgement that her future no longer belonged to fear. Ethan nodded back, understanding the moment without needing it explained. They loaded the children into the truck, Ranger climbing in last, settling between the girls like a living shield. As they drove away from the courthouse, the ranch was quiet when they returned from the courthouse. The afternoon light stretched long shadows across the snow, and the wind moved gently through the broken fence line. It was the same place Ethan had left that morning, yet it felt different, as if the land itself recognized the change in the family it was sheltering. Sarah stepped out of the truck with the baby in her arms. Her daughters followed, staying close but no longer clutching her clothes in fear. There was still tension in their posture, but it wasn't the fragile tension of escaping. It was the cautious kind that comes when life finally pauses long enough to take a real breath. Inside the cabin, Ethan stoked the fire until it burned brighter. Ranger circled the children once before settling near the hearth, his eyes half open, still watching everything. For the first time since she arrived, Sarah removed her shawl and hung it by the door. A simple gesture, but Ethan noticed. It meant she no longer felt the need to keep her belongings ready for sudden flight. They moved through the evening with slow, steady motions. Sarah cooked a modest meal, a pot of stew that filled the cabin with warmth deeper than heat. The children sat near the table, talking more than they had in days. Their voices were soft, but they carried a cautious excitement, the kind that grows when fear begins to lose its grip. After dinner, Ethan stepped outside. The cold air bit at his cheeks, but he didn't mind. He walked to the shed, examining what still needed repair. Broken beams, loose planks, and warped door frames. The same problems he'd seen for months, but now they felt solvable. He heard footsteps behind him. Sarah stood a few feet away, bundled in a blanket. "You don't have to do that tonight," she said. "I know." But Ethan didn't step away from the work. His hand rested on the damaged frame, as if feeling the weight of its history. Sarah looked at the shed for a long moment. "This place, it's been through a lot." "So have we," Ethan replied. She gave a small nod, not agreement, but acknowledgement. Her eyes shifted to the hillside where the landslide had torn through the old horse pasture. The ground was uneven, still marked by the force that had taken Ethan's brother. The silence between them didn't grow heavy. It simply settled. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. It wasn't about the shed, and Ethan understood. "You don't owe me that," he said. "Not for any of it." Sarah wrapped the blanket tighter. "I know, but loss connects people in ways nothing else can." Ethan exhaled slowly, the breath turning to vapor in the cold. "Then maybe that's why you're here," he said. "Not because of what we've lost, but because of what we're trying to rebuild." Sarah didn't answer right away. But for the first time since their paths crossed, her eyes held something other than fear or exhaustion, a hint of steadiness, a beginning. Ranger bounded out of the cabin suddenly, breaking the moment with the enthusiasm of a creature who had no understanding of complicated human emotions. The dog stopped between them, tail wagging, as if announcing that whatever conversation they were having was over for the night. Sarah smiled, a small, tired smile, but real. "Your dog knows when to interrupt. He thinks he's in charge," Ethan replied. They walked back to the cabin together, not touching, not speaking, but moving with a shared rhythm that hadn't existed earlier. Inside, the children were already settling down under warm blankets. The fire crackled steadily. For the first time, the cabin felt less like a temporary shelter and more like a place that could hold a future. Before heading to her room, Sarah paused beside Ethan. "Thank you," she said. Not for rescuing her, not for the courtroom, but for something simpler, for giving her family a place where the night wasn't a threat. Ethan nodded once. "You don't have to face any of this alone." The words held no promise beyond the moment, but the moment was enough. As the lights dimmed and the winter night, 3 days passed with a growing sense of quiet stability. Not comfort, not yet, but a rhythm that felt steady enough to hold. The children began exploring the yard in short bursts, staying within sight of the cabin. Their laughter was tentative, like a sound they were relearning. Ranger followed them everywhere, tail swaying, alert to every shift in their energy. Sarah watched from the porch, the baby tucked against her shoulder, her eyes softening each time the children dared to play a little more freely. Inside the cabin, Ethan repaired a loose floorboard. He worked in calm movements, occasionally glancing toward the porch to check on Sarah and the kids. Something about the scene, the soft winter light, the distant sound of children's voices, made the cabin feel fuller than it had in years. For a brief moment, it felt like the world had settled. Then Ranger stopped moving. He froze in the middle of the yard, ears forward, body rigid, the stance of a dog who had just heard something that didn't belong. Ethan straightened immediately. "What is it?" he murmured. The children paused. Sarah turned sharply, her expression tightening in an instant. The sound came again, faint, distant, mechanical, a rumble too smooth to be from a ranch truck, too forceful to be wind. Ethan stepped off the porch, scanning the road beyond the tree line. Ranger trotted ahead, posture tense. Sarah moved the children behind her, instinct returning like a reflex sharpened by years of fear. A vehicle appeared on the far end of the road. Not black like Towen's truck, not the sheriff's. Something else. A county vehicle, white, with an official emblem on the door. Ethan relaxed, just slightly. Government vehicles didn't usually bring trouble, but they rarely brought comfort either. The car stopped near the porch. A middle-aged woman stepped out, her coat thick, her breath forming small clouds in the cold air. She carried a leather folder tucked under her arm. "Morning," she said. "I'm Lisa Grant from Child and Family Services. Sheriff Maddox notified us about the case. I'm here for a wellness follow-up." Sarah stiffened immediately. Not from guilt, but from the old instinct of someone used to being judged by strangers. Ethan stepped forward. "They're safe here," he said. "You'll see for yourself." Lisa offered a brief nod. "I'm not here to disrupt anything, just to ensure the transition is stable and the children have what they need." She walked toward the porch slowly, giving the kids time to adjust to her presence. Ranger positioned himself between her and the family, not hostile, just protective. She paused and let him sniff her hand before proceeding. Inside the cabin, Lisa observed everything with quiet professionalism. The warmth of the stove, the blankets, the food supply, the space where the children slept. She asked gentle questions, never raising her voice, never pushing beyond what was needed. But Sarah still stood with her back straight, shoulders lifted slightly, a posture created by years of being evaluated by someone who held power. Ethan noticed. So did the social worker. At one point, Lisa spoke directly to Sarah. "You've done a hard thing," she said. "Leaving is never easy. You and your children are safe now, and you're allowed to feel that." Sarah didn't answer, but her exhale was long and unsteady, like a door cracking open for the first time. After nearly an hour, Lisa closed her folder. "You're doing well," she said. "I'll file a positive report. Sheriff Maddox will keep the protective order enforced. If you need anything, supplies, counseling, legal assistance, the county will support you." Ethan walked her to the door. She paused before stepping outside. "Mr. Hale," she added, lowering her voice, "I've seen a lot of cases. What you're doing matters, but be prepared." The days that followed were quieter than anyone expected. Cold still clung to the Montana hills, but the wind began to lose its sharp edges. The snow hardened into a thin crust, and patches of brown earth appeared along the fence line, small reminders that winter would eventually loosen its grip. Inside the cabin, the routine continued to take shape. The children had begun sleeping through the night. Sarah no longer checked the door 3 times before bed, and Ethan found himself listening less for danger, more for the sounds of a house returning to life. Footsteps, quiet voices, the soft clatter of tin cups during breakfast. It wasn't peace, not fully, but it was movement toward it. One afternoon, while the sky was clear enough to show a pale line of blue, Ethan brought out a stack of lumber he had salvaged from the old barn. Ranger trotted behind him, tail low but relaxed. Sarah stepped outside with the baby wrapped in a thick blanket. The cold air made the child blink in surprise. "You're building something new?" she asked. "Fixing something old?" Ethan replied, placing a beam on the sawhorse. "I want the shed stable before the next storm hits." Sarah nodded, then glanced toward the slope where the landslide had torn the hillside apart. The earth there was still uneven, still scarred. "You ever think about leaving this place?" she asked quietly. "Every day," Ethan admitted, "but staying feels like the only way to make something of what's left." A long pause followed, not uncomfortable, just honest. "I didn't have a choice about leaving," Sarah said, "but staying anywhere has always felt temporary." Ethan looked up at her. "You don't owe this place anything. If you need to move on, I'll help you." She held the baby a little closer. "I'm not thinking about leaving," she said softly. "I'm thinking about what it means to stay." Before Ethan could respond, the children came running around the corner of the cabin. "Ranger found something," the oldest girl called. Ethan and Sarah exchanged a look, then followed them to the far side of the yard. Ranger sat beside a half-buried wooden frame, his head tilted proudly, as if announcing a major discovery. Ethan knelt and cleared the snow from around it. It was the door to an old root cellar, a place his parents had used to store potatoes and preserves in the cold seasons. "I thought this was destroyed in the landslide," Ethan murmured. He lifted the latch. The hinges groaned but held. Inside, the cellar was dry enough to save, cracked in places, but intact. Sarah peered down into the earth. "This could be useful. Food storage, supplies." "It could," Ethan agreed. There was something symbolic in the discovery, finding a piece of the past that wasn't broken, a space that could support the future rather than weigh it down. The children seemed to sense this too. They stood quietly, watching as if expecting the darkness inside the cellar to reveal something magical. "We'll clean it out together," Sarah said. "Tomorrow," Ethan answered. "Daylight will make it easier." When they walked back toward the cabin, Sarah slowed her steps. Sometimes the miracles in our lives don't arrive with angels, trumpets, or rays of light breaking through the clouds. Sometimes they appear quietly. In a stranger who stops on a frozen road, in a mother who finds the strength to flee the darkness, in a child's laughter returning after years of silence, or in a home once broken, slowly learning to breathe again. Perhaps that is how God works most often, not in grand displays, but in small moments of courage, in the hands that reach toward us when the world feels cold, in the people He places in our path at the exact moment we can no longer walk alone. And maybe the real miracle is this: no matter how heavy the winter, no matter how long the storm, God never lets us face it by ourselves. If you are going through a season that feels dark or endless, hold on. God's timing is perfect. His mercy is steady, and He is already preparing